ever since about 1880, there have been predictions by so-called experts, usually technologists, that oil will disappear in 10 years. In other words, in 1890, big shots in the oil industry, technologists said, oil will disappear in 10 years. And every 10 years since then, they've been saying the same damn thing. They said that the latest big thing was very popular in the 1970s during the Carter administration, the so-called Club of Rome, which is a very high-powered group of technologists in Italy and MIT, who, using high-speed computers and all that, came to the conclusion oil would disappear by 1980 or 1984, or whatever the year was. They, of course, all have egg on their faces at this point, have quietly went back to the woodwork. The basic reason why they made these forecasts is they didn't understand anything about prices and left prices out of the system. In other words, basically, it's a very simple way of doing it, but it's basically what they did. All these guys have been doing. If you say you have 100 million barrels, let's say, of oil in the ground, as reserves, and the consumption rate is 10 million barrels a year, okay, then in 10 years we'll run out of oil. That's essentially what they did. You don't need computers for this. All you need is a slide rule, okay? So in 10 years, the forecast, my God, there's only 100 million barrels under the ground. There's 10 million barrels a year being used. Therefore, in 10 years, we also cut our throat. And the problem with this is, one, that these reserves are only a small fraction of the real reserve. These are only the reserves which have been mapped and surveyed and officially there. There's an enormous amount of oil down there which hasn't been mapped yet. And two is the consumption rate depends on, and also the reserves depend on the price system. In other words, prices are always tossed out of these things. There's almost no engineers or technologists understand about prices, and so that gets tossed out. Okay, and what happens, as you all should know by this time, is if this is oil or natural gas or whatever it is, or lumber or whatever it is, as the supply decreases, the price goes up. And as the price goes up, two things happen. One, the consumers start tightening their belts because it's more costly. They start conserving, quote unquote. In other words, they use less of it, as we did with water last year and stuff like that. They use less of it. It was done with gasoline during the late 70s. And then, since the price is higher, there's more of an incentive to go out and look for more, and also look for alternative energy sources. In other words, since the price is now higher, it's more profitable to go out and find oil and drill it, map it, all the rest of it that's involved. It's not just to find oil. It costs a lot of money. You have to go out and look. You have to drill. You have to employ geologists go around, scout around, and stuff like that. And it's not economic to do it at this level, let's say this price, but it does become economic to do it up here. The result of all this is, one, to cut consumption, two, to increase supply later on, and the price falls, and also the supplies go up. So reserves, even though we've been using a lot of oil since 1890, the total reserves on the ground now are higher than they were in 1890, because it's an expansible thing. It's not fixed at whatever this was, 100 million barrels. It keeps growing as there's more incentive to go out and look for sources. So that's the basic problem with the technologists who forecast the end of resources. They don't understand about prices. The energy crisis really begins around 1830 or 40 when whales run out. I don't know did I cover this last time? No. Whales used to be the big energy source for lamps, whale oil. Okay? And whales began to die out. The reason why they died out was quite simple. It was, we can call whale communism. In other words, you still through the fish, still through a fish in general. Whales, there's communism of whales. In other words, you can kill any whale you get. If you find a whale and kill it, you own it. But you can't own the whole school or whatever the technological unit is for whales. So you can't say, okay, I own this little group here. If you own the whole group, that's your economic incentive. Every time you kill a whale, you try to replace it. In other words, grow more whales, so you have a higher capital resources. Your assets grow. But if nobody owns the whales in general, or the school of fish, or the salmon, or whatever it happens to be, then the incentive is to kill the whale before the other guy kills it. There's no incentive to breed more whales because somebody else could come along and kill it. You have no property rights in the whales. Basically, what the problem is, it's the whole problem of natural resources. We'll cover again later on. We get to natural resources, but basically, it's agriculture used to be in the same position as oceans are now. Land, there's no private ownership in land. You own whatever you shoot or whatever you gather. So the so-called hunting and gathering society. in the old days, long time ago. So people ate, they hunted deer or beaver or whatever it is, and they killed the beaver or the deer, and they owned that thing as they kill, but they couldn't own the whole herd. So there was beaver communism or deer communism, and the same way with gathering. They couldn't own any land. They just owned whatever seeds or nuts or whatever berries that they actually picked. Obviously, this means a very low productive society. Can't sustain very many people by gathering nuts and hunting on the run. So what happened is, as land got scarcer, and population grew, etc., we began to develop private property in land called agriculture. An enormous step forward, which meant that people could take the land and transform it, not just pick berries off it or pick nuts or gather nuts or whatever. They can actually transform the land and sow stuff and reap and all that sort of thing without worrying about other people eating this, coming in and grabbing it, because they own this land and they own therefore the fruits of it. So with private property comes agriculture. In other words, it's really agriculture is a consequence of private property rights, and this meant an enormous development of standard of living and production and everything else. Because then you could take the land and transform it. You don't have to be stuck with, the berries that you pick and stuff like that. You can actually grow things and produce them. Well, we're now on the ocean. We're now still in the situation of hunting and gathering. We can own the fish that we catch, but we can't own the actual school or the herd or whatever you want to call it. It's technologically different for every kind of fish, of course. It's difficult to generalize. But basically, that's what we can say. To increase the productivity of the ocean is what we need, and there's private property in parts of the ocean, regardless of how this works, whether it's the school of the salmon or whatever it happens to be. And we're beginning to get that, because the ocean is the next great frontier of resources. We're beginning to get private property. It's come the long struggle of all the sea treaty at the UN was, I think, properly rejected by the United States because they didn't allow for any private property in these parts of the ocean. Essentially, world UN government commission was supposed to own everything. It would have been a disaster. At any rate, the result of this is beginning to be private property in parts of the ocean now. There's, of course, offshore oil drilling, right, where you own your platform and the stuff that you drill and all the rest of it. There's offshore oil. There's lots of that now. There's manganese nodules in the bottom of the ocean. People are beginning to mine that. But they can only do that, you see, if they're rest of the assurance that the government will protect them against people coming and grabbing the manganese nodules after they start mining it. Obviously, you have to have equipment and so forth. They're beginning to have that. This will be more and more as time goes on. This is the next great wave of the future. In addition to space, there's also the oceans. And the Japanese now have oyster beds systematically, not owned by private enterprise, but owned by the municipalities offshore. So this is coming in more and more. You need it more and more because you have parts of the ocean now which have lots of things can happen to it, like trawlers and drills coming in and stuff like that. You can't have 2 or 3 things going at once because they'll run into each other. You have to have some way of allocating the space, and private property is the easiest way to do it. So at any rate, once we get that, we'll have aquaculture or aquiculture. And the productivity increase will be enormous. You won't be able to believe it. Fish, for example, in the fish situation, in order to increase the productivity of fish, one simple thing, and lots of things could be done, one simple thing could make an enormous difference. Fish, unfortunately, haven't read the 10 Commandments. They don't understand about fish tend to be cannibals, eating even their own cousins, brothers, and sisters. So, if you segregate fish by size, in other words, small fish in this area, medium-sized fish here, and large fish there, just doing that would tremendously increase the productivity of fish. Then you feed the fish also guck, algae or whatever, powder, whatever they eat. So now you can say, how can you fence all parts of the ocean? Isn't that uneconomic? You can't put barbed wire down there. Well, now we can do it electronically very easily. Electronic barriers separating fish by size. That in itself would tremendously increase the fish population. But there's no incentive to do that if some other guy come along and grab them. Yeah. Do they? Okay. Oh, mm-hmm. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Uh-huh. Right. 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 Yeah. Right. And they segregate it by size, right? Great. That's even simpler than the electronic, but it could be done that way too. Sure. Yeah, great. So that's going to, as I say, that's the wave of the future. There'll be more and more of this going on. A friend of mine, or an acquaintance of mine, did that with turtles. Turtles are in bad shape. I mean, they're lovable turtles, but they're, the environmentalists act as if only people kill animals. Actually, most animals are killed by other animals. Animals haven't read the Ten Commandments either. So animals don't respect the rights of, quote, rights unquote, of other animals. So turtles are in bad shape. The turtle starts off deposited on a beach somewhere in the West Indies, okay? And a little baby turtle, in order to save itself, has to crawl at a low speed from the back of the beach to the ocean. Once it reaches the ocean, it's safe. Then it can grow and develop. Unfortunately, a lot of predators between the beach and the ocean, little baby turtles, birds, and all sorts of other animals or whatever, eat the turtles. So the turtle population is an endangered species, not because of man, but because of other animals. So a friend of mine decided he's going to grow turtles, breed them, and also increase their population. So he did that. What he did is essentially save the turtles. In other words, he segregated them from the birds, whatever, ways of guarding the turtles. The turtles then multiplied in population. He then killed some turtles and made turtle soup out of it and exported them to the United States. But the average turtle population was much higher when he was doing it than before. So the environmentalists, of course, say this is a terrible thing. He's destroying the turtle population, not understanding any of this stuff, not wanting to understand it. And so they prohibited, they got the United States government, being very powerful lobby environmentalists, got them to prohibit importation of this guy's turtles from the West Indies to the United States. And of course, the United States was a major market, and his business went bankrupt, and the turtles are now getting extinct again. Okay? So this is another example of government intervention claiming to save the turtles and actually helping to destroy them. So this is because of the environmentalist lobby. At any rate, and there's lots of cases like this of saving a population in order to breed them, because your profit is involved in trying to maintain the turtles or seals or whatever they happen to be, and keep them active, can't kill them all, of course, but you want to have them reproduce and all the rest of it. So at any rate, so aquaculture is going to be the next frontier, private property in various ways in parts of the ocean. It hasn't arrived yet. And in 1830, the whales were getting decimated. And so what happened was, this was the first energy crisis, the first modern energy crisis. Where are we going to have any lamps? We have to go back to the cave, because whale oil lamps were the major lamp. Well, since there was no International Energy Commission to solve the energy problem in the 1840s, 1830s, what simply happened was as the supply of whales declined, the price of whale oil went up, doubled, tripled, etc. And then people said, Jesus, it's getting very expensive. Let's look around for another energy resource, another way of having lamps. In other words, the incentive was there, because the price was so high, you could go around and look for other stuff. So there was, for many centuries, this black ooze called petroleum, which was a big waste product. It was not considered a resource. It was considered a pain in the neck, because it had nothing to do with it. It was just useless. It was just a waste. It destroyed, and no trees grew, it wasn't that sort of stuff. And so they began to discover, technologically, that petroleum could be used very well for lamps. Kerosene, be refined into kerosene used for lamps. And they started using oil, petroleum on the surface of lakes and stuff like that. And pretty soon, of course, that got too expensive. They used up, and they started drilling. And the rest is history. 1859 was the first oil well drilled in the world in western Pennsylvania. And they discovered they don't have to rely on the surface petroleum. There's lots of it underneath. And that starts the whole petroleum industry. And then, of course, very quickly, they find that petroleum is better anyway, cheaper than whale oil. And then, of course, they started using kerosene. So this first energy crisis was solved not by government planning, not by people worrying about it, or writing books about it, but by simply the price going up and other people then getting incentive to find some kind of alternative energy resource, which then turned out to be petroleum, which, remember, had no use before that at all for centuries. Okay, so and more petroleum was discovered, and natural gas later. From then on, okay, there was constant new discoveries. First, it was thought in the United States that western Pennsylvania is the only place you can find oil. That's it. So God has decreed that oil is only in western Pennsylvania. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which had a, quote, monopoly, unquote, on oil refining in that period, believed in their heart and soul that only western Pennsylvania will have oil. So when they discovered oil in Texas, when the first discoveries came in, Standard Oil said, it's a flash in the pan. And then other younger companies rushed in, like Gulf and Texaco, which were originally quite small, and said, hey, no, we think this is important. We're not stuck. We don't care about western Pennsylvania. And they turn out to be right, and this is the beginning of the end of the Standard Oil's monopoly on oil refining. So this continues. So more or less had a free market in oil until about the early 1930s, when during the Depression, oil prices, there was a big new discoveries in Texas, Oklahoma, and the price of oil went down magnificently, about something like 3 cents a barrel, something like that. It was great. And the oil companies then put pressure on the governors of Texas and Oklahoma that you have to stop this. We have to do something to cartelize the system. In other words, once again, getting to the cartel part, go into later on, here the supply of oil has increased, means the price of oil is much cheaper. We have to help out the oil industry by having government in some way restrict supply and raise the price, and of course, increasing total revenue, assuming it's going to be an inelastic demand curve for the industry. And so they prevail, the oil industry prevail upon the governor of Oklahoma and the governor of Texas. The governor of Oklahoma was a colorful character named Alfalfa Bill Murray. And it's the sort of people they have in Oklahoma, named Alfalfa Bill. And he decreed an immediate moratorium on all drilling of oil, making it illegal, and he mobilized the National Guard, and he would send troops into the oil fields to shoot anybody who was drilling oil. Even their own oil, I'm talking about, not other people's oil. I also thought there should be a movie made out of this. It would be very colorful. You have the dead of night, you have the oil fires in the oil fields and all that, and the guys in the National Guard coming in and shooting people. At any rate, so this is a moratorium on all oil production. Of course, the supply goes way down, the price goes up. But this, of course, you couldn't have a permanent situation of the National Guard shooting oil men. So this is as they worked out the permanent solution of this, to have a stable, continuing permanent cartel of oil, and it was called oil proration laws. And this was the system, by the way, which was then reinforced. First of all, every state had it, mostly Texas and Oklahoma, which were the major producing states, and California, a few others. And then the federal government in 1935 passed the Hot Oil Act, which decreed, first of all, ratified this oil production agreements, oil cartel agreements, and also outlaw the shipment interstate of so-called hot oil. In other words, oil which was beyond the limited production quotas, which was more than the minimum maximum quotas, and then making that a federal crime. So the result of all that was to fight to enforce. Federal and state governments enforcing an oil cartel, which lasted from about 1933 to about until the 1970s. The way it worked, for me, the most annoying part of it was first the system itself was monstrous, but the most annoying part was the philosophical arguments for it given by the oil industry and the guys running it. Economic quote arguments unquote. They, of course, didn't say we want to cartelize the oil industry. It wouldn't fly in the American public. We want to restrict production. Actually, what happened was, every month, the State Regulatory Commission, in Texas, for some reason, it's the Texas Railroad Commission, which presumably runs regulates Texas railroads and also oil. It got shoved in there for some reason. And usually, it was run for many years by a retired general. And the Texas Railroad Commission, I guess it's about three people or 5 people, every month, like January the 1st, they would issue a quota for every oil well for the next month, for the month of January. In other words, a maximum production quota. As they say, but there'd be a quota for the whole state of Texas. Maximum quota, let's say 100 million barrels. I have no idea what the number is. Let's say 100 million barrels. That'd be a max. If you produce more than 100 million barrels, you get shot. Right, or whatever the legal fine is, legal penalty. Each oil well then gets a share of a quota. In other words, here's an oil well which gets 0.1% of the total Texas oil. So its quota is whatever this is. It'll be a million, say 100,000 barrels for the month. If it produces more than that, the owner gets shot. So in other words, it's a very rigid maximum production quota, pushing the supply curve to the left and trying to and raising the price of oil, of crude oil. This, of course, means the price of all the other oil went up. Oil products went up not because the cost was passed through, as I'll insist on later on, but simply because the supply is cut. So this means the supply of gasoline is cut, the supply of kerosene or whatever. So all these prices go up. So the consumer is screwed, for the benefit of the oil industry as a whole in Texas or Oklahoma or whatever, and also against any individual competitor who would like to break through this thing and think he can do a more efficient job of it. So everybody's stuck with the quotas as whatever is determined by the State Railroad Commission. And as I say, reinforce and enforce interstate commerce by the Federal Oil Proration Commission, whatever they call themselves. And the rationale was the Texas Railroad Commission would put out leaflets, and also the oil industry, and they say something like this. The oil industry, the American Petroleum Institute, which is a major trade association, we're in favor of the free market. We love the free market. We're against government interference. However, in this particular case, in order to equate supply and demand, get this, now you should know enough to realize the fallacy of this right away. We have to equate supply and demand. In order to do it, the Texas Railroad Commission has to issue a production. We have to estimate what demand will be next month, what consumer demand will be for purchase of oil, and then we will set the official quota so as to equalize supply and demand. In our wisdom, we know we can see what the consumers will want to buy for the whole month, and then we will regulate it. And this equates supply and demand. These same people have the nerve to say they're in favor of the free market. Okay? And what they're saying here is that, gee, in order demand is sort of a fixed quantity, which of course we know is nonsense, because demand depends on price. In other words, the 100 million barrels, if the price is cut, maybe it might be 150 million barrels. You can't estimate how much the consumers will buy if you don't know what the price is. So the consumption varies in accordance with price, number one, the first fallacy. And the second fallacy is you need some damn railroad commission to figure out what the supply, to equate supply and demand. All you need is a free price system. It's the price system moving up and down which equates supply and demand without any government officials claiming to estimate, claiming to bring them into equality. So that's the second big fallacy, that on the market, the supply and demand are automatically equated to each other by a free movement of prices, as we all know by this time. You don't need it, so the Railroad Commission they can't equate anything, because they're simply assuming the prices, the supply and demand is such and such, and the supply will therefore be such and such. What they want to do is restrict supply and raise prices. That's their whole shtick. They didn't say that, of course. This is all because I don't think the public would have quite gone for it. You can't tell the public you want to cut their throat. That's your objective. You have to tell them it's all for the good of the country and the public and all that. So at any rate, this system persisted, as I say, for about 40 years. And the result was a permanent restriction on supply and a permanent rise in prices. And also over-drilling, because it meant if you can get a drill in there, you had this kind of situation. The incentive was to drill a lot of oil wells and get in on the quota if you can. So you have a lot of excessive number of oil wells, and each one being used only like 5% of capacity or 10% of capacity. You have a lot of uneconomic use of resources just in that sense. Too many oil wells, and each oil well being used, instead of being used to the capacity, being used like 3 days a month or whatever, depending on, what the quota is, how much they want to jack the price up. So that was the situation. It was certainly a disgrace, especially in an industry which claimed they were in favor of free competition and free markets. By about the late 1950s, after about 25 years ago this, they found out, as always happens with cartels, there's a hitch. The hitch is we can't shut the world out. In other words, you take a cartel price, here's the world prices tend to be about the same for the same product. Oil, copper, they tend to be about the same throughout because you can make a profit. If copper, let's say, costs a lot more in France than it does in the United States, the incentive is to buy copper in the United States and sell it in France, thereby tending to equalize prices, unless the government restricts it or something. But the basic tendency is toward a uniform price in each product. Well, here you have a situation from 1933 on, the price of oil, crude oil in the United States, and therefore petroleum, and therefore gasoline and all the rest of the stuff, is being raised way above the world market price. Okay? So instead of being just about equal, or relatively roughly equal, the price of oil is now jacked up artificially by this cartel arrangement, by this government-enforced cartel. Well, and the people who buy oil, like oil refineries, let's say, or utilities, whatever, consumers, you get down to the final ultimate, well, they'll start saying, well, Jesus, the hell with domestic oil, it's too expensive, let's start buying foreign oil. Now, domestic oil had a built-in advantage. First of all, transportation costs are cheaper. It's cheaper to ship oil from Texas to New Jersey, let's say, where the refinery is, and to ship it from Saudi Arabia to New Jersey. And second of all, American crude oil happens to be better quality than most foreign crude oil, less sand in it, whatever it is. In other words, the quality is such the refineries are better able to use it. So the tendency would have been to use domestic oil. But because of this artificial cartelization, there started then being a big boom importing foreign oil. So this begins the so-called foreign oil crisis. In other words, after about 20, 25 years of this, as more and more oil is imported because of this artificial price thing, the oil industry starts bellyaching, especially the crude oil people. Of course, there's no monolithic oil industry, you understand. There's the crude oil people in Texas who only produce crude. There's the refineries, the big refineries, which often produce both. I mean, refine and produce crude, and others which only refine. So it's a very complex industry. There's also a lot of middlemen, etc. So, and those who transport stuff. At any rate, to make it to try and simplify it, basically what happens is oil refiners start importing oil from foreign countries because the crude oil is cheaper. So naturally, by the late 1950s, what's the response to this? The rational response of this, from the point of view of the public welfare or whatever, would have been to scrap the whole thing, scrap oil proration laws and allow the domestic oil price to be cheap, to fall to the foreign oil price, and then we would have stopped losing business to foreign oil producers. Of course, they didn't do that. Because the answer of cartelists everywhere is keep out the foreign oil, goddammit. In other words, they don't blame themselves for making oil too expensive. They say foreigners are evil. Foreign oil bad, domestic oil good. As a matter of fact, when Jimmy Carter went on the air for his famous energy speech, 1978 or 79, he almost said that. He held up oil or something, a thimbleful, whatever it was. He almost said things like foreign oil bad, domestic oil good. As if there's something about the quality of the oil in here is going to foreign, some kind of taint. Anyway, so the next step was to keep out foreign oil. As one response to that was to sever the oil market, segregate it, so as to justify, to rationalize the cartel. In other words, to keep the cartel prices in order to keep the competition out. Say foreign oil is evil for some reason and then keep it out. One way of doing it is by tariffs. You slap an extra tax, so to speak, an import tax on oil, which they're talking about doing now, by the way. Right now, as we're sitting here, those SOBs in Washington are saying, well, gee, oil's getting cheaper. We have to do something. We have to put a big oil import tax on and raise the price so the consumers won't benefit. They don't put it in those terms. That's basically it. They're afraid we might benefit by cheaper oil. And at any rate, but that wouldn't have been enough. They figure out foreign oil threat, quote unquote, is too great. Therefore, have an oil import quota. In other words, means you to put a maximum amount, physical maximum on amount of oil that can be imported. You just freeze it. And just like you have domestic oil production quota, you now have a foreign oil import quota, which is what they did in 1958. The Texas oil producers lobbied. Texas, of course, is a very powerful state politically and all that, et cetera, et cetera. The federal government passed an oil import agreement, which froze in other words, here you have oil. Here's domestic oil. The supply is shifting to the left, so foreign oil then comes in. And this shifted foreign oil to the left. In other words, it throttled down the supply of foreign oil plus domestic oil and saved the cartel for a while. Now, of course, the foreign oil producers got very upset about this. Obviously, what happens to the foreign oil producers, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, whoever they happen to be, is here they had a situation. Here's the price quantity. Here was the demand for foreign oil was going up, mostly the United States demand, because American consumers and refiners are shifting to foreign oil. And all of a sudden, bingo, the demand goes down again even more because of U.S. law. In other words, the United States says, no, you can't import more than X amount. And so all of a sudden they find their demand curve falling and the price falling of foreign oil. And of course the profits going down, losses, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, what the United States government did, they shafted two groups of people for the benefit of the Texas oil cartelists. The American consumers, who of course found their prices going up and a supply cut, and foreign oil producers in Arab countries and Venezuela and whatever, and Indonesia, whoever had oil, suddenly found their prices fell, the demand curve fell, because of U.S. government action. As a result, a year later, 1959, the oil-producing countries, in desperation, as a defensive measure, formed the famous OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. as an attempt to form a cartel to compete, to do battle against the American cartel. This, of course, has been forgotten by professional anti-OPEC baiters because who claim up until very recently OPEC was an all-powerful cartel which would set its own price of oil and holding American consumers at ransom and putting a gun at their throats, so on and so on. Actually, OPEC begins as a purely defensive operation and horror at the American import quota which was levied upon them. Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Also, OPEC for a long time couldn't do a damn thing. In other words, they formed a cartel, but they could not prevail against basic market forces plus the American buying cartel, so to speak. And OPEC had no power whatsoever, couldn't raise the price of oil for many years. It's not as if as soon as they were formed, they then had everybody by the throat. They couldn't do a damn thing. So from 1959 until 1973, the price of oil, if anything, fell rather than went up. And in real terms, in other words, correcting for inflation, you always have to realize that most prices are always going up because of inflation. Correcting for inflation, the price of oil fell very sharply from 1958 straight through to early 70s, 1973. It was approximately, it's probably about $2 a barrel, maybe even less than that all this time. And a lot of that was due to the tax the Arab countries levied on the oil firms that are actually producing the oil. So it would have been even the actual cost of oil was something like 30 cents a barrel or something like that. At the point of production in Saudi Arabia and all the other Gulf countries. What happened by the early 70s is the Arab governments began to nationalize the oil and of course didn't kick out the Western oil companies. What they did was simply levy a tax. In other words, instead of owning the oil companies could then use it, but only by paying a heavy tax to the Arab governments, which raised the price of about $2 a barrel from from 30 cents a barrel. It's a big raise, but compared to what it is now, of course, it's peanuts. So nothing really happened. OPEC had no economic power. In other words, it was not able to raise the price of crude oil in the market until the famous crisis of 1973-74, to which we now turn. The crisis is very heavily related to Nixon's famous price control, which I've already talked about. Nixon froze prices from August 1971 until the spring of 1974. And so the prices were more or less, there was a heavy price control, one thing or another. And when the spring of 74 came along, I guess the 73 was the big oil crisis in the Middle East. I guess the last Israel war, Arab wars, I guess 73, right? 72, late 72 or 73. Yeah, 73. So the supplies began to be cut. And then there was an Arab oil embargo. And so you had then a supply being sharply cut of oil coming in from the Middle East, which was then the major oil producing region. And this hits. Now, ordinarily, what would have happened as a result of the Arab oil embargo was simply a rise in price. In other words, supply cut, the price rises, and that'd be more or less the end of it. Unfortunately, this came just about at the time of the winter of 73, 74. We still had price controls. Okay? So what then happened was sudden scarcity of oil due to the Arab embargo, the war in the Arab embargo was reflected not so much in a rise in prices. Prices were prevented from rising, but a sudden shortage developing. And the shortage could not be cured by prices going up because of the Nixon's price control set up. And so there was the first big so-called oil shortage and gasoline shortage, 73, 74, or actually spring of 74, I guess. And it was reflected in, no heating oil disappeared, long on gasoline, everybody runs out of gasoline and so forth and so on. And to meet that, instead of allowing the price of gasoline or oil to go up, as a matter of fact, when Nixon removed price controls in the spring of 74, he kept them on oil and gas, as a special bonus, special icing on the cake, because there was a shortage, right? It's typical nonsense of bureaucrats. If there's a shortage, you have to keep the controls, not realizing, of course, the shortage is caused by the controls. Notice what would have happened. Without the price controls, Oil would have been scarcer. No question about that, because of the Arab embargo. The result would have been a higher price and no shortage. But because of the price controls were on and then extended for oil and gas from then on during the 70s, this meant perpetuating the shortage and making it a real crisis. You couldn't find oil, couldn't find heating oil. People were dying in New York because of the cold, and gasoline disappears on the highways and so forth and so on. I think the gasoline shortage lasted for about 2 months. There was long lines. And then immediately the government, in order to handle this, starts up with crazy regulations, just like the water shortage. Except here they had an obvious, you don't have to install meters. All they had to do was allow the price to go up. They kept the price controls and met the shortages by the following sort of methods. First of all, establishing priorities. In other words, if there's a shortage, immediately the government steps in and decides who should be able to get the rationing of gas, in other words. There were no ration tickets, although they started making ration tickets for the next crisis. And they said, by the way, one interesting thing, the next time we have gasoline rationing, it won't be like World War II when we were tyrannical and didn't allow people to sell their own ration tickets to other people. They'd allow a market in ration tickets. So if you don't want to use your car next week, you can sell, 3 gallons or 30 gallons worth of tickets to somebody else. They would allow couldn't call it a free market, a market in ration tickets. So-called white market, they call it, because it would have been legal, you say. At any rate, they had all sorts of priorities set up. For example, top priorities got gasoline off the top. They were allowed to buy gasoline. Others were screwed. Who were the top priorities? You can imagine. One, government officials. Naturally. Every government official is considered absolutely necessary for everything. Okay? If you're a government official, you've got an immediate priority thing. You can get gasoline at the market price. Two, of course, farmers. Automatically beloved for some reason in American politics. Everybody loves farmers. So farmers get the second priority. Everybody else has to scramble for it. I guess doctors on Sunday call or something, things like that. Doctors on emergency. And that's about it. Everybody else has to hoof it. So, and then they had other regulations, like anybody, you could only buy gasoline on the days when your license ends in an odd number, you can only buy Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If it ends in an even number, you can only buy Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. You can't buy gasoline at all on Saturday or Sunday. Except, of course, for doctors, you can get special. Just a whole network of nonsense. And fortunately, after about a month or two of this, I guess Nixon's advisor said, "Look, all you have to do is to allow the price to go up, and it'll cure the shortage." And sure enough, he did. He kept the controls, unfortunately, but he said allow the price to go up to more or less the market price. The price of gasoline in those days, before 1973, was a magnificent and lovely 30 cents a gallon. That was about it. And he allowed it to go up to about 50 cents a gallon. That was the end of it. And was that clear the market, even with the scarcity. Okay. So the hysteria was over, but then, of course, the government starts issuing crazy. First of all, they kept the controls permanently, for all sorts of terrible effects that we'll go through in a minute. And they kept all sorts of other regulations. And they issued all sorts of decrees to try to, quote, cure the energy shortage, unquote. This was the beginning, by the way, around 1974, of the unbelievably monstrous 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. Nobody talked about safety then. No talk about it saved lives or anything like that. That comes later as an after rationalization afterward. The original rationale for the 55-mile-an-hour limit was to save gasoline, to help cure the shortage. It was then pointed out, after the thing was passed, that it didn't really save much gasoline at all. In the first place, what it did, or still does, is to waste a lot of time. I mean, if you're a truck that's driving carrying stuff from California to New York, you have to drive at 55 miles an hour, you're wasting several more days worth of cost. So the cost gets restrict supply and add on to price, obviously. Very compulsory inefficiency. It's like a negative railroad or a negative highway. It's like chopping up a highway. And I'm thinking you're helping out the economic situation. Secondly, they didn't really save much gas even without that, because most trucks were built in those days, so their maximum gasoline efficiency was 70 miles an hour. So if they're forced to drive at 55, they were wasting more gas than they would have otherwise. But the thing is still on, of course, the 55 mile an hour limit, and we'll deal with that a little bit later. But and it's totally crazy. Here, these highways out in the West, there's no people, there's no trees, there's no nothing. There's nothing. If you leave the highway, there's no different than the highway, virtually, right? And anyway, take a 10-minute break. The alleged saving of fuel, the 55-mile-an-hour limit. Now that only came later. This life-saving thing came as a. Yeah, I figured it out. First of all, since only a third of total vehicle mileage runs on streets or roads which you can go more than 55 miles an hour. In other words, about 2/3 is on city streets and places like that where you can't. Nobody, one hopes, goes 70 miles an hour. So you take that into consideration and total fuel savings only the maximum of 2.6%. And then when you realize that many of the trucks, as I said, were geared towards 70 miles an hour, the most efficient gear ratios and stuff like that, the saving was minimal, more than offset by the amount of time wasted. The fact they had to spend several days more on driving, et cetera, et cetera. So, then came the next rationale for keeping this thing was the alleged saving of lives, and which turns out to be a lot of nonsense also. Traffic deaths the statistic is traffic deaths per 100 million miles driven. These have been going down steadily since 1925. Had nothing to do with mile an hour limits. They were essentially due to the fact that the cars got safer and roads got safer. Okay? For example, this is a statistic of traffic deaths per 100 million miles driven. And 1925 it was 19. 1935 was 15. 1945 it was 10. 1960 was 5. And 1973, before the 55-mile-an-hour limit, was about 4. It went down later in the 70s to about 3.6 or something like that. But most of that has been figured out. Nothing to do with the limits. First of all, it was a general trend. Take a general trend of downward trend of traffic fatalities. Also, the fact that the same reduction took place in city streets where there never had been any 70 miles an hour. There was a limit. The change of the limit from 70 to 55 does not apply to city streets, suburbs, and all that. And there was more of a reduction there than in the interstate highways. So it's figured out that most of the reduction, whatever reduction took place, which wasn't much. In other words, it went down from 4 to 3.3 or something like that at the end of the 70s. Most of that reduction was due to things like more interstate highways. Quiet, please. More interstate highways. Most of the fatalities of traffic accidents do not take place at high speeds. They take place in local streets and roads. The interstate highways are the safest place. And there were more interstate highways per local road during the 70s than before, as more got built. Also, better tires, safety belts coming in, and all the rest of it. In West Germany, where there's a magnificent tradition of no speed limits at all on interstate highways, it's magnificent. As a matter of fact, when you drive on Autobahns, which are the German interstate highways, and you drive at 90 miles an hour, you're in a slow lane, but you're being passed very rapidly by other cars zipping along at 100. The accidents are minimal, almost none at all. Most of the West German traffic deaths take place in local roads where there are speed limits. So, what? Autobahn? I thought it was unlimited. It's not unlimited? Huh? It is still unlimited. Of course. At any rate, according to the traffic, according to the traffic experts, what reduces fatalities, keeps accidents at a minimum, is a constant flow, constant speed, regardless of what the speed is. Of course, the real problem comes in changing speeds, which of course takes place on local roads and things like that. It therefore makes no sense at all to have a uniform speed limit for the whole country. Every local conditions are different, and the speed limit should be, changed in accordance with the local conditions, like 25 mile an hour in a school zone, all that sort of stuff, which we're used to in local roads. And so keeping the speed limit is sort of a lot of nonsense for interstate highways on the west, where there's hardly any people, hardly any cars, hardly any houses, nothing. And so anyway, the whole thing becomes absurd. By the way, on safety belts, I should tell you about something which is being carefully kept from us by the establishment. It's true that the use of safety belts has reduced fatalities of people in cars to some extent. However, it's also increased the fatalities of pedestrians because it's made drivers a little bit more reckless, and so they zip around and hit pedestrians more than they did before. That's the sort of stuff the National Safety Council never tells you. At any rate, a friend of mine has done a study on that, and it's the other side of the coin of the safety belt. Okay. To get back to the energy, the alleged energy shortage, when they allowed the price of gasoline to go up from 30 cents a gallon to about 50, the shortage was over. However, they kept this whole structure of controls all during the 70s. They kept allocation controls and price controls for crude oil and for gasoline. And they also set up a typical cartel or rationing arrangement where everybody was supposed to be supplied. If you're a gas station, let's say, you had to be supplied by your alleged employer, whether it's Exxon or whatever it is, by a certain quota, a minimum quota of gasoline every month. The quota was set on conditions of 1973, before the Great Crisis. And this continued all during the 1970s, this quota system. As a result, you had something like this. Let's say there's a gas station in upstate New York, which in 1973 sold, I have no idea how many gallons of gas they sell every month. Let's say 2,000, right? And upstate New York, what happens, of course, over time, when you set the quota in the spring of 74, it makes a little bit of sense because the quota is the conditions are very similar to the way like the base year. However, as time goes on, there's always changes, especially in the United States, it's a fast-changing society. And over the 1970s, upstate New York begins to collapse from a not too high a level to begin with. The economy begins to collapse, New England begins to collapse, and people move from New England and upstate New York to California and Texas. I mean, there's been a big trend of population shift from places like upstate New York, from Middle West, West Virginia, whatever, Iowa, to Texas, Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, and California. Well, as a result of quotas, gas station quota in upstate New York, they might have a minimum quota of 2,000 a month. They might be only using 1,000. They have 1,000 excess gallons sitting around, which they can then return at the end of the month, let's say, to Exxon. Another thing that happens is the refineries were compelled by law, by federal regulation, to keep shipping the same amount of gasoline every month, regardless of the quality of the service of the gas station. In other words, essentially, before that, say Exxon or Mobil were employers, so to speak, of these franchise gas stations. They didn't shape up. If there were complaints by consumers to the vice president of Exxon or something, they cracked down on the gas station. Now the federal government said, no, you can't do that. Regardless of what happens, you have to supply the same 2,000 gallons a month. As a result, the individual gas station the quality of service began to go down. Now, this is very visible. I remember in the 70s, I asked a friend of mine who was an expert on economics of gas and oil, etc. And I said, why are they not giving any free maps anymore? I'm a big map fan. I like lots of maps. Free maps began to disappear. This is by the mid-70s. And also, the lovable washing of windshields and the general snapping to attention when you drive up, all this began to collapse, especially, of course, in New York, where they're never very lovable anyway. They stopped washing the back of the window, all the rest of it. And so he said, well, the thing is, they have this compulsory rule now where they have to get Mobil or whatever has to supply each gas station the same quota. If the gas station thumbs their nose at the consumer and Mobil, they don't care anymore. And so that's the beginning of the end, the cracking up, the decline in quality as a result of the price control arrangement, rationing arrangement coming in. So another thing that happens is these guys in western Massachusetts and upstate New York have plenty of gasoline, and always had throughout the entire crisis of 1979, by the way. Throughout, they were swimming in gasoline. In the meantime, in the new areas, California, Texas, etc., especially California, remote from the action, there were new gas stations all the time. They couldn't get their quota. In other words, they found, here's a new gas station, but they didn't have any quota from 1973 because they weren't around in 1973. Therefore, they were screwed. Very much like new people trying to find an apartment under rent control. Can't get your quota. So many gas stations began to collapse, go bankrupt, go under in California starting about 1976 or so. By the way, the result of this, of OPEC's finally getting their action in here, the result of this embargo, etc., was a permanent rise in oil prices, which had been something like $2 a barrel before that, crude oil, now went up to about 10. approximately $10 a barrel. A five-fold increase in the early 70s. And as a result, by the way, of this rise in gasoline prices and oil prices, there began to be some kind of conservation in a sense of people beginning to cut consumption. Not much yet, but still to some extent begins then. And people beginning to insulate their homes so they spend less money on fuel oil, et cetera, et cetera. And it begins to be the slight shift toward compact cars as we get more per gallon, et cetera. Anyway, so California gas stations begin to collapse, and then the price controls were such, after they allow the initial increase to 50 cents a gallon, they say you can't increase prices anymore, something like rent control, now like vacancy decontrol, you allow an initial increase. You can only increase your gasoline prices if you can justify it by, say, an increase of crude oil prices or, in a raw material. If the crude oil price goes up by 10%, you're allowed to increase your gasoline prices by 10%. However, they do not include labor costs, they don't include rent charges, that sort of stuff. So as a result, gas stations began to go out of business in California for that reason. In other words, they began to losing money because they weren't allowed to increase their gasoline prices up to the free market level. And so gasoline prices went up very slowly. Remember, there was a big inflation during the late 70s, 10% a year, 12% a year. Gasoline prices were only allowed to go up a little bit. They went up to about 70 cents by, say, the late 70s, 60, 70 cents. So you began to have these peculiar situations where gasoline shortages in California began to show up, or Texas, and particularly California, but lots of surpluses here. Finally, in 1979, a second great crisis, which lasted even longer than the 73, the Iran Revolution, which was the excuse for that, cutting off of Iranian oil for a while. And so as a result of that, the supply again gets cut. And but we still have price controls on gasoline and oil, continuing since 1973. And so as the supply gets cut again, and the price of oil now goes up, by the way, in the 79 crisis to about $30 a barrel, further tripling. The result of that was again a severe gasoline shortage, oil shortage, and all the rest of it. The same damn thing occurs in 79 because the prices were kept at 70 cents, 65 cents, and whatever a gallon. It begins in California. At the same time, New York had plenty of gasoline. California was the cutting edge of this because they didn't have a quota. The gasoline shortage begins there in the summer of 79 and hits here in the fall. And as it hits, the same sort of stuff begins to happen. Black markets. For example, if you're an old customer of a certain gas station, what you do is you park your gas. Say you use a certain garage gas station. You park your car at night. In the morning, you get there and you find that magically the tank is now filled, even though it's a big rationing. Okay. That's if you're an old and valued customer. If you're not an old and valued customer, you whistle for it. So favoritism begins to come in. The old customer bit, black market charges. Also, in California, begins the gas stations closing. They didn't have any gasoline. Also, big lines. Now, long lines. Of course, in California, everybody has to ride a car. No such thing as buses and that sort of stuff, or subway. So you're there. You have to get to work, and there are 50 cars lined up, and the lines are very slow and so forth. And a lot of hysteria begins to develop. First of all, somebody wants to cut in. Cutting in line, and in this kind of situation, caused all sorts of fights. You go out and punch out the guys trying to cut in. Murders even took place on the gas line. Social conflict emerges. And general hatred of the gasoline station, hatred of your fellow comrades trying to get gasoline, and all the rest of it. And also crazy regulations coming again. Once again, rationing was decreed by the federal government. Top priority, government officials. And we always had plenty of gasoline. Second priority, farmers. I guess the same thing. Third priority, surgeons, doctors paying house emergency calls on Sunday. So again, you have the same odd, even license plate regulations, even more so than before, because this lasted by about 6 months, at least in California. It lasted much longer than the 73 crisis. And you had situations such as northern and upstate New York and northern and western New England, plenty of gasoline, never had any shortage. They were swimming in it. But they had a quota. And the companies had to send them the oil by federal mandate. In California, they were closing up, and after a few months, New York City had the same problem. So once again, what to do about it, big problem, big crisis, et cetera, et cetera. Carter goes on the air, Carter had a this is a big crisis, he had a big energy problem, what to do about all this. And he went, apparently he scheduled a big TV speech on energy for a certain night, and had everybody alerted. Suddenly he canceled it an hour before because he said he had to rethink everything. This was the beginning of the view that Carter was a nut, which took hold at that point and continued ever since. And he went up to the mountaintop, literally, I think he went to Camp David, and he communed with all the big shots. He communed with John Kenneth Galbraith, he communed with everybody, philosophers, and he came back with his famous moral crisis speech, or moral malaise, I guess it is. America's suffering from moral malaise. It doesn't go over very well either. At any rate, apparently what happened was, the inside dope on that was his two big economists, Secretary of Treasury Blumenthal, who was one of his big economic advisors, Secretary of Energy Schlesinger, who was had been an economist originally, had been hip deep in this whole control system, all in favor of it, finally came to the conclusion the only thing to do is to repeal, scrap the whole thing, go back to the free market. That was their recommendation. Apparently Carter was going to do it, which would have ended the whole crisis right then. Unfortunately, his Georgia crony said, you can't do that, you look like a weak president. Only weak presidents repeal control. Strong presidents impose control. So purely for political reasons, he shifted the whole thing, went and came up with his famous energy package, which just made things worse. We'll go into a little bit of that, because there are all sorts of interesting ramifications of this oil stuff. At any rate, what finally happened in the beginning, what happened was there'd be ads in the paper, which gas stations that have gas today, that sort of stuff, 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever. They have them only from 9 in the morning to 11 in the morning. So very, very scarce. I'm just in long lines trying to get it. So one heroic gas station illegally said, okay, we have plenty of gasoline. We're charging, however, $1 a gallon. So the traditional, customary, and lovable 70 cents. And they broke the tidal wave. They had plenty of gasoline, 24 hours a day. Yes, sir. Back to service. Back to no lines. And this magical thing paved the way, and then they all broke it. All the gas stations in the area started charging $1 a gallon. There's plenty of gasoline. That, I think, blazed the path for the government to start to say, okay, they finally scrapped, after lots of headaches, lots of recriminations, they finally scrapped the price control. At least to the extent of allowing it to go up once again to about $1 a gallon, $1.10, and that was the end of the gasoline shortage for '79. It took longer for this to sink in, because the Carter administration was more resistant than the Nixon administration had been to a little bit of enlightenment, so to speak. But at any rate, that was the upshot. There was a lot of other, however, continued on, a lot of other ramifications here, because in addition to this oil problem, there's also a natural gas crisis brought about by very different elements, but reinforcing the whole '79 problem. Natural gas is a competitor, of course, with oil for energy, as is coal. There's also a coal problem. And natural gas is a complicated, it's transported by pipeline, and the federal government starts regulating pipelines very early. At any rate, in 1954, I think it is, the Supreme Court tells the Federal Power Commission, which those days was regulating the price of natural gas, that they had to regulate it. The Federal Power Commission didn't want to regulate it. The Eisenhower administration was more free market oriented. The Supreme Court said, no, you have to regulate it. And then they wind up, in the late 50s, they freeze the price of natural gas at 1956 or whatever prices. Okay? And they kept it that way from then on until the late 70s. As a matter of fact, maybe the early 80s. So the price of natural gas was frozen at the old 1956 level. Now, of course, what then happens, you can tell what happens. First, nothing happens because it's the regular price. But then as the inflation proceeds, the lovable 1956 price becomes ridiculous and becomes more and more below the free market level. So here you have a situation where you have natural gas and the price is frozen at the late 50s level. Price keeps going up because of inflation, and you wind up with increasing shortages. And the price becomes more and more unrealistic. And natural gas takes a few years to change prices because the way the industry runs is there are long-term contracts. The pipeline makes a long-term contract with the producer, so it takes about 3 to 4 years for the price to change. It's like a long-term lease. But after a while, I began to realize there was a shortage. In the meantime, before the shortage developed, natural gas looks like a big, hey, let's get natural gas. It's much cheaper than oil now because natural gas price is frozen. And so public utilities in the Northeast and other regular homes and businesses start shifting from oil to natural gas, and particularly from coal to natural gas, by the way. And so natural gas becomes artificially cheap. And people, of course, buy a lot more of it, and the result is increasing the shortage, which begins to develop by about the early 70s. And so which gets bigger and bigger, of course. And as the natural gas the shortage gets worse and worse, people stop looking for it. The price is too cheap. There's no reason to look for more natural gas. The supply starts going down, which makes the shortage even worse. So what finally begins to happen on natural gas front, about the same time as the oil crisis, once again, the authorities understand the incentive effect. They don't understand the rationing effect. So they start an incredible, crazy quilt of natural gas regulation, much of which still exists now, by the way. So it's a little bit better. But they say, okay, we want more. We realize that the supply of natural gas is falling off. So what we'll do is we'll allow a higher price, more or less a free market price. Let's see, it's up here now. For new oil, but old oil has to come in at the cheap price, the level below price of 1954. So they set up a whole insane system of price regulation where usually, of course, new gas and old gas are the same. It's the same gas. It's the same. You have the same price. Now you have a whole system of a whole patchwork of controls. So the new gas is whatever it is per cubic foot, and old gas is much cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. You have a whole structure, a whole insane price structure imposed by the government. Well, what happens, of course, you have an old gas well. What are you going to do? You're not going to keep producing an old gas well at half the price that you get for new gas. What you do is you shut down the old gas, you start looking for new gas. So this whole nutty system where old gas disappears, and where they abandon the old gas well, which is perfectly usable. And since the price is half of what you can get, a third of what you can get is for new gas, you start getting new gas. Also, there's fake new gas wells pop up. You take an old gas well, you sell it to some other guy, quasi-racketeer. He patches up a little bit and calls it a new gas well, I guess it's wells. And there's all sorts of middlemen buying and selling rights to new gas. The whole structure caused by the control setup. At any rate, what you have is a big shortage of gas develops in the Northeast and Middle West, etc. In the meantime, there was no regulation for intrastate. All this regulation is interstate. So you have, so as a result of that, in Texas, within Texas and Oklahoma, which are the major natural gas producers, they have a free market price for natural gas, whereas in New York or Michigan or something, they still have the old control price, like so. And so, as a result, the price of natural gas in Texas is like 3 times the amount as it was in Michigan. And usually, of course, the price of Michigan is higher because it costs some money to ship the gas from Texas to Michigan. So usually, the price of natural gas in Michigan, say, price of natural gas Michigan equals the price of natural gas in Texas, okay, plus the cost of shipping natural gas from Texas to Michigan. So usually the price in Michigan is higher than the price in Texas, okay? But because of this crazy situation of the price control interstate but not intrastate, you wind up with 3 times, something like $1 per cubic foot or whatever, against 30 cents, 3 times the amount in Texas. As a result, Texas had plenty of natural gas and Michigan had none. If you're a Texas natural gas producer, are you going to sell to other people in Texas for 3 times the amount, or sell it to somebody in Michigan for 1/3 the amount? Obviously, the answer is obvious. The result is there was never any natural gas shortage in Texas or Oklahoma, but lots of shortages outside. It was a nutty situation. So the Carter administration tried to cure that by, as I say, this old gas, new gas, which didn't work, and slapping on controls in Texas, which didn't help much either. It simply created a shortage in Texas, didn't relieve the shortage in Michigan and New York and whatever. So anyway, the natural gas is still a problem. It's been alleviated somewhat. In the Carter package, this other nutty things which I'll go into next time, he said, okay, we will eliminate price control, all price controls and allocation controls, all these federal controls on natural gas, on crude oil and on gasoline and heating oil, as of September 1981. I think this passed in 79 or 80. This is the Carter energy package. So in other words, he said, okay, in September 1981, we will eliminate these controls. So it's a phase out. Natural gas, he didn't do anything about. And When Reagan came in, the first thing that Reagan did, the first week in office, it was Reagan's free market week. And the first thing he did was eliminate oil price controls and allocations as of January, as soon as he came in. So what he did was he simply advanced the date from September to January. He didn't deregulate any more than Carter would have, except that Carter would have taken 9 more months or whatever it is. At any rate, so he immediately eliminated all price controls and allocation controls, rationing controls on all petroleum products and petroleum. And the result was, you're keeping it below the free market price. The result was, which could have been predicted by, in fact, I did predict it in Economics, 251, but you're keeping it below the market price. If initially there's an increase in price for about a week or 2 weeks, then bingo, since you now have a free market, there's no problem about shortages. Immediately people start finding more and more oil, producing more and more oil. And the result was a decline in price, which continues to this day. As a matter of fact, this is the beginning of the great price decline. Started immediately after the elimination of the price control. So here, most people were predicting, hey, it's going to be terrible. Oil prices will double, will triple, from $30 a barrel, etc., and whatever the consequences in gasoline and fuel are. Just the opposite happened. This is the beginning of the great turndown. As soon as Reagan eliminated price controls on oil and gasoline and all the rest of it, the price started going down, both in gasoline and in crude oil. So it was $30 a barrel. At that point, it's now down. It's magnificent now, by the way. It's now down to about 15, I think, and dropping continually. So this is the beginning of the breaking of the OPEC cartel, the elimination of the price control. The rise in price is very short, and as soon as the free market, they realized free market developing, oil started pouring in from everywhere. Another thing that happened to OPEC was that as a result of the OPEC driving the price up to $30 a barrel, other countries began to look for oil, not just OPEC countries. So you have a big shift in proportion. One of the reasons why the OPEC cartel has now collapsed is most oil is now being produced by non-OPEC countries. Great Britain, with the North Sea oil thing, Mexico, various countries that are outside the cartel, could therefore didn't restrict their production. In other words, Saudi Arabia and the other OPEC countries are constantly restricting production so they can keep the price up. These other countries are not part of it. They don't care. They're taking advantage. They're busting the cartel. They're cartel busters where they come in and they they don't have to limit their production. They just lower the price. The result of that has been the smashing of the OPEC cartel at long last. And a friend of mine who's an oil economics expert claims they're going to go down $8 a barrel. But anyway, it's certainly rolling in that direction. And by the way, the same people who have been belly aching for 10 years or more, that the OPEC was holding us all by the throat, was creating inflation and all that, these same people are now belly aching. Their terrible thing, price of oil is falling. Now, it can't be a terrible thing to rise and also to fall. There's something very odd about this. Actually, we should all welcome price falls at all times. Should be, if it goes down to 0, it's even better. Okay.